All right, Lisa. So before we went live here, we were talking about how someone who is genuinely a victim can also play the victim at the same time. And you had made a comment in one of my posts the other day, basically explaining that and how you did that in your own life. And that's what I want to hear about now is what happened to you a little bit and then what you did from there.
Okay. Um, I think, well, first of all, I was victimized as a child. Um, and I think the word victim gets a bad rap sometimes because people use it to make people feel bad, like they feel bad about that word. And I want to remove that stigma because I think it's important for children, especially who've been victimized, to be able to express that without feeling like saying they're a victim is a bad thing, right? Um, in my case, I never really felt like a victim in the beginning because um, I I didn't think I was responsible for what happened to me, but I was responsible for what happened to everybody else. If I kept the family secrets, it protected everybody else. So I kind of almost, being a little kid, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, almost kind of felt like the hero a little bit. Like I was protecting my sisters and protecting my mom, and so I didn't really look at myself as a victim. But when I did finally tell adults what was going on with me at 12, nobody believed me. And so I never had the opportunity to embrace the concept of being a victim. And so I think I spent many years trying to express that, in a way that would be heard, that I had been a victim of something and I was really harmed and hurt, and I couldn't do that because nobody believed me. Nobody wanted to hear it. Even like later on in my life, like nobody wants to hear that shit. They just don't, right? Um, but I learned pretty quickly that I could use what had happened to me, my trauma, to manipulate people and get their sympathy. I didn't feel lovable. I wasn't loved um, as a kid, and I was not liked very much either by my family. And so I didn't think I was worthy of love, or capable of receiving love. So pity or sympathy was like the next best
Mm.
thing. And so because I had so much body anxiety as a kid, because I was going through so much stress and trauma and I didn't know how to deal with it, I would have a lot of headaches and stomach aches and stuff like that. So I was always sick, and my mom would call me a hypochondriac. And and I mean, literally, I did feel sick to my stomach. I did have headaches, but they were probably mostly emotionally driven. Um,
And you were a
but
victim of SA for people who don't know.
Oh,
Like,
yeah. I mean, every, physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional abuse, sexual, the whole thing. And but because my mom didn't believe me and kind of cast me as the villain in the whole situation, um, like there wasn't even a lot of sympathy from her. But as I got a little bit older, I would tell my tale of woe and people would feel sorry for me, and
ah,
then maybe they would like me or be my friend, but I never believed I would get love, but maybe they would at least not hurt me.
mm,
Um, because I lived just like a deer in the headlights. I was surviving on the
right.
streets, and so I learned to use what happened to me to my advantage.
Like a survival mechanism is what it sounds like.
It was a survival mechanism. And um, so another survival mechanism that I had was using drugs and alcohol to self-medicate my pain, my emotional pain, trauma. I had no healthy coping skills, and if people would call me on that, if anybody would, call me on my using, I would throw that trauma stuff back in their face and be like, "Well, if you had my life, you'd use too, and you don't understand what it was like to be me." And like, and it would back everybody up because who's going to argue with that, right?
It's very effective. You're very effective.
It was very effective.
Because it's true though, right? That's the thing. Like you were a victim,
I
and
was.
you could play the victim a little bit too,
Right.
because it was effective. It works.
Right. Right. And see, and it is effective, but it's only effective in keeping me sick.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
it was effective in keeping me sick, in that it allowed me to continue using far longer because people just kind of left me alone, and it allowed me to continue to be sick because I was so disempowered. Like I was disempowered by my running away from the pain. Like my life goal was pain avoidance at that point. And so everything I did to avoid pain did nothing but create more chaos and pain in my life. And I never wanted to look at myself, because it wasn't my fault. It was the fault of the people who hurt me. And so I never took any personal responsibility for my own actions or behavior moving forward. I just blamed everything on what had happened in the past. And it wasn't until I, took me a long time to figure it out. But it wasn't until I realized that I was never going to be in any position of power to take control of my life or do anything to move up in life until I took personal responsibility for whatever I did next. Right. That I could not continue at 30 to blame my next move on what happened when I was 8.
Right. I like that term you used too, the pain avoidance. That's really what, like the survival mechanisms of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, everything falls into that, where it's one way to stay safe. It's a way to avoid pain. And whether that's people pleasing, playing the victim, or going into that freeze state, fawning, all of that is under the same umbrella. It's different manifestations of the same thing, basically.
Right. And the way that I lived was, because I was so disempowered, I didn't know I was disempowered. I didn't know much, right? I was just kind of like surviving, right? So I thought I just had this black cloud that like followed me wherever I went. And I was so unlucky, and God hated me, and all this awful stuff happened because, I was just like a bad seed, or I was evil or something, like I never understood that it was my inaction most of the time that created more problems in my life, because I just thought like life was going to toss me around and my job was just to land on my feet and keep it moving. And it wasn't until that I started to take personal responsibility for my life and my choices that I felt like I had some power to like move in any kind of direction without just getting like kicked around by life. But every time life would kick me around, I'd be like, see, like, I suck, right? See, poor me, like, feel sorry for me because look how hard my life is, and look at all the awful things that happened to me. And pity is not a good substitute for love. Sympathy is not the next best thing to being liked or loved. It really isn't. It's a very lonely place to be.
Right.
And
because people don't call you out on it though either too, right? We're in a society right now where a lot of people, if you say you're a victim about something, people are going to be really hesitant to try to like encourage you to grow at all. All they're going to want to do is just validate what you're thinking. And they'll say, okay, yep, you're that. Okay. So
I think it depends on who you surround yourself with.
Yeah.
You need to surround yourself with truth tellers and not cosigners.
Well, because on one hand, I think it's important to get validated too, but there also comes a point where it's like, okay, it's no longer working for you. It's no longer helping you. And someone who's truly going to be your friend, they might be able to point that out to you in a loving and caring way. But what allowed you to start taking personal responsibility in your life? Was there like a big event that happened, or was it a subtle shift?
Well, for me, it was entering a 12-step program and learning the principles of recovery. And one of the main principles is being accountable and taking personal responsibility for your life and your actions. And not that I was responsible for what happened to me in the past, but I was responsible to not continue using that in the future to make excuses for myself. And like there's so many different ways that still filters into my life today. My life today is pretty good. But I still find myself having a tendency to want to like overshare my backstory with people just so I can justify having a good life now.
Interesting.
Like I don't want to feel like people don't like I need people to know that it's hard for me to get here, or I had to struggle to get here, and it wasn't easy, it didn't get handed to me. Like I have to make like justify my happiness. I can't just be happy or have fun or enjoy life or whatever without somebody knowing that it wasn't easy to get here. So that there's still parts of me that still in that way like are living in victimhood, because I still think on some level I don't qualify for just being loved and accepted as I am without be I would love to just throw that whole story away. Like not be a victim, not be a survivor, not be like the hero or the savior or anything else, like to just be who I am now, like moving forward, and leave that backstory behind. But I do find myself like sharing it too often. Like it's one thing if I'm sharing it to inspire somebody who's maybe in the shoes I was in, to show them that they can have something more, something better for themselves. But if that's not why I'm sharing it, if I'm just sharing it so I'm eliciting some sort of emotional reaction from somebody or whatever, then
Is that what it is though? Just to get the emotional reaction, or is there something deeper than that?
I think it's nuanced echoes of wanting people to understand me and like me and accept me. And because I'm neurodivergent, I think that I always feel like a weirdo, like I just always feel weird. I always feel awkward. I always feel different. I'm always on the outside looking in. Like I never feel like I'm a part of. I always feel like I'm apart from.
So
And
sharing that could be a part of this is why I am how I
it's
am.
kind of like,
If you think
yeah,
I'm weird or awkward, it's because of this.
yeah, it's because
Okay.
I'm damaged goods, right? Like, it's so, and it's like so humbling to like say this out loud right now, right? Like
Freeing.
all these years later, but it's true. Like, I think there's like the only way for us to get better is to acknowledge whatever dysfunction we have going on. So if I don't acknowledge that I still engage in that kind of behavior sometimes, I'm never going to get better at it. Like I'm never going to get better with it. I'm never going to grow beyond it. We can only fix what we acknowledge. And so by me saying, I can see that I pretty much overshare with people that I have no business oversharing with. Like it's not for their benefit. I'm doing it for self-serving motives. If I say that out loud, then I can feel the shame of that and
Right.
the embarrassment of that, and that kind of motivates me to want to change. That ick. You ever feel like just ick about yourself? Like,
Sure.
yeah. So if I'm feeling ick about myself, then it motivates me to change. So,
Yeah, I mean, I
like,
think for you, it's like if you can notice it in the moment. Oh, I'm tempted to share my story right now. I'm tempted to go into the backstory. What's
right,
going on right now? Do I want this person's approval? Do I want this person to have a certain response? Do I want
right,
to just to feel comfortable in my own skin? Do I want just to feel accepted? What is it? I think just knowing that can really go a far way, and then finding a way to take a step back in that moment and be like, okay, what's a better way to maybe communicate the same thing? Like, oh,
right,
maybe I'm feeling a little awkward and weird right now. And just simply say it. And a lot of times, if someone says that, I think the people who are on your same wavelength, they're going to get it. They're going to say, okay, yeah, I get that. As opposed to like doing the roundabout way of
yeah,
telling the story. Now, granted, telling the story has its place too, of course. Telling that
right,
story can have its place in certain settings. But I think the biggest thing I run into for people is just the very acknowledgement of, hey, there might be some things you can work on your side of the street will be victim blaming or soft victim blaming. That's what they come at me with. And then I say to them, I mean, how can you ever expect to grow if you can't even look at your side of the street without considering it victim blaming? And the one person said to me the other day, because I was talking about it in reference to narcissistic abuse, and they said, well, would you say the same thing to an SA victim? And I would say to them, well, I do say there's something to learn in every situation. It doesn't mean something was your fault.
Right.
But like in a brutal case, right? So they use the SA example. So say someone gets drugged at a bar. They left their drink unattended or something, and they get drugged in a bar. I would say, well, it's not that person's fault, but maybe they don't leave their drink unattended next time. That's what to learn. But just even like just to say that, I know people would get furious even hearing that. Like, oh, wait, they could have done anything better? You're saying it's their fault? Like, no.
Well,
It's
that
just
happened to me.
right.
That exact thing happened to me. I was in a bar and I was drugged, and the next thing I know, I'm being pushed out of a moving car onto the gutter in Philadelphia.
And that was your
And
book. In your book, that story too.
well, yeah, it was. And so was it my fault that that happened? No. But did I belong in that bar in Camden at a strip club? No, I didn't. I didn't, like I was, like I had no business being there in the first place.
And
Right.
this doesn't make it's
So
not
it
your
doesn't mean I
fault because of
deserved it. It doesn't mean I deserved it or anything like that. But I have to take personal responsibility that my choices put me in positions that I would not be in otherwise that get me in trouble. Like if I'm using drugs and I'm going to cop on the corner and I get mugged or beat or whatever, like, is it my fault? Did I deserve it? No, but I put myself on that corner, right? Now, when I was a kid, I had no direct, like no choice. There was no direct action that I'm not saying that I had no choice, but I did have a choice on whether to use that to throw it in people's faces or make them feel bad for me or back them up because I didn't want them to call me on my shit. Like that was a choice.
And that's a big thing to clarify too. Like when someone's a kid, there is no choice when you're a kid, especially like what happened to you with a stepfather. Like there is no choices in that. It's like there's nothing you could have done differently at all. And but then as you get older, you can choose to whether you use that story or not. That's something to do differently. But people just really struggle with it. They really struggle with, okay, it's not my fault. I didn't deserve it. But there still can be things, I shouldn't say but, and there's things I can be doing differently. Like it's not like a condemnation to say there's things you can do differently. To me, that's the empowerment part. That's the part that, hey, that's the only thing you have control over.
Right.
Wouldn't you want to try to do something differently? Wouldn't you want to try to be in a position where you are the least likely to become a victim again? And why wouldn't you want that? Unless they're using it for certain things, unless they're getting something out of it that helps them in some ways. That's probably the reason.
It's hard for somebody who's been victimized to hear that and not immediately become defensive. Like, I didn't want that to happen. Are you saying that I'm getting something out of it? It's it's more like we have to separate the event that occurred, that where we were a victim, from how we carry that forward in our life, right? Like you're talking about keeping your side of the street clean. Like I need to look at myself. Like blame is pretty pointless to me. Like it doesn't matter whose fault anything was in the past or anything else. Like what am I doing today? What am I doing today? What am I going to do tomorrow? Instead of saying why me, like ask what's next. Because I have no control over what happened then, but I can look back and reflect and say, okay, like some things I have no control over. Some things I put myself in a bad spot when I shouldn't have. Some things, whatever. But from here on out, like I am responsible for what happens next in my life. Now, does that mean bad things aren't going to happen? No. Does that mean that I'm not going to make poor choices? Of course I am, because I'm a human, but I'm going to be more thoughtful, and the more thoughtful I can be about the choices I make and not be blaming my conditions today on what happened many, many years ago, the more power I have to change my life. If I don't take any responsibility for my actions, I'm never going to get better. My life is never going to get better.
Right.
And living in that hood, that victimhood, like it's a bad neighborhood, man. Like it sucks. It sucks. And you know, how do I say this? We're all we can do is look at ourselves, like look inside and be honest with ourselves. Like we don't even have to be honest with anybody else, but we at least need to be honest with ourselves and say, am I using anything that happened to me in the past as an excuse for the crappy behavior I'm engaging in now, or the crappy decisions I'm making now? Am I using anything that happened in the past, regardless of whose fault it is? Am I using anything from my past to excuse anything that I'm doing or thinking or feeling or now?
You know what really helped me with this too? And I think you mentioned the rooms before. A lot of it was the rooms where if I got an initial jolt, like a negative jolt from being criticized or being rightfully called out about something, I would instantly go with that feeling and be like, I would just react and maybe yell, scream, lash out at the person that I thought caused that feeling in me. And I was just identified with that feeling. I wasn't able to say, okay, let's take a step back. I understand that I feel this negative jolt. And I think that's how the people who are like, when they're really in a victim place, that's what happens to them. They get that negative jolt and then they just lash out, and they're not able to take that step back. But I think it's important for people that are maybe in your spot and my spot to say, yeah, sometimes that jolt can still happen. Like if I get called out, yeah, I can get a jolt. Yeah, if someone mentions that, oh, maybe you're doing this, maybe you're playing the victim, I could get a jolt if I ever do that. And I think it's important to recognize that sometimes that feeling's still there, but we don't have to act on that feeling. And that's where the growth comes in, where we're able to not do that anymore. So it's not like we don't ever feel those feelings anymore. Like they can still happen. Those feelings can happen, but what do we choose to do when we feel those feelings? That's what like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is all about. That between stimulus and the response, there's a gap that you can choose your response in. And that's what it's all about. So anyone who has CPTSD or is a victim of some sort, or maybe they're the people that get super mad when someone compares CPTSD to narcissism or ADHD to narcissism. And just even hearing the two things in the same sentence, they think is out of line. It's like, what's going on for someone? Because this is literally what someone said to me just yesterday, that, oh, it's out of line for you to say the words CPTSD and narcissism in the same sentence.
But they're both mental conditions, right? Like, and how is somebody that that grew up to become narcissistic or have narcissistic personality disorder any more responsible or less responsible than somebody who grew up to have CPTSD? Like, they're both, it's not like anybody chooses to have one or the other. Like, you know what I mean? They're conditions that people are dealing with. I think we need to destigmatize and devillainize all of that. I mean, as soon as we place ourselves in a victim role, then somebody's got to be the villain. Whether it's, somebody in your life, or it's the system, or it's other mental illnesses are the villain to your victim illness. Like, really, like,
we see that everywhere too, right? We see that in the political sphere. If you're a Republican, it means the Democrats are the villain. If you're a Democrat, it means Trump's the villain. And you can say this in every walk of life. We're so dichotomous. I think this is our black and white thinking as a society right now.
It doesn't serve us at all.
Absolutely not. Right. So, but even for me and like what I do talking about narcissism, that in some ways it can contribute to the problem. And in some ways it helps. Like it's not black or white. It's not 100% good, but it's not 100% bad either. I think it can be a mixed bag if I don't make sure that I don't say to villainize folks, if I don't continually try to emphasize that or continually say like, oh, just because we're talking about this doesn't mean we're perfect. Doesn't mean there's not things that we could also probably be improving too. which is also true, right? And that's the temptation, is that when you're constantly pointing out how other people are doing wrong, like, what are you not doing? Reflecting on your own self and where you could be doing better. And it's tempting because a lot of it turns into entertainment in a way.
Mm.
People watch the narcissism stuff because it's entertaining, it's interesting, educational, and I get it. And it does help people too, but it can also go too far. It can go too far for anybody if they get hooked on it.
Well, yeah,
And
it's
then
much more fun to bash somebody else than it is to look at yourself and feel the discomfort of your own ick, you know?
and I think, but what you said though is important, and I think some of it comes off with, if we're able to acknowledge some of our shortcomings and the things that we're doing wrong, it makes it easier for other people to admit them too and say, okay, like the guy we're listening to here or the woman we're listening to here, they're able to admit some things about themselves. They're able to have some self reflection and self honesty and admit their shortcomings. Some people aren't able to do that, or like any admitting of a shortcoming, then they think people are going to attack them or whatever. But I think it's important to mention that part of it too, to balance it out, as opposed to just, and why doesn't this happen though? It doesn't happen because in social media game, the narcissism topic becomes what gives you views. And so it turns that the business motive of it gets in the way. And guess what though? The business part of it gets in the way of everything, whether it's politics, whether it's fill in the blank with whatever, religion, spirituality. That profit motive can get in the way of everything. And what we talked about before we went live, the two undercurrents, right? The profit motive, because everyone needs money. You can't survive in America too long without it. And the sex motive too. That's the other thing that's the undercurrent of so many things. But between those two things, it does impact so much.
It's true. It's true. So, I mean, the way that I try and live my life is to compare myself to myself and to focus on my side of the street and not taking things personally.
It's hard.
So
It's hard to do though.
it's super hard. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work. And am I successful at it on a daily basis? Sometimes. Sometimes I'm not. Sometimes, if I walk in a room and people stop talking, of course they're talking about me, right? Like, what are they talking? Like, it's all about me. Am I a narcissist? Like, I'll just go down those rabbit holes because I'll think, oh, I'm pretty self-absorbed. So I think there's nothing wrong with questioning those things and diving into, what parts of our personalities or our character, like, we might need to work on.
Right. Let me read this here to you. My friend P Dubs says, emotional dysregulation in people, if their window of tolerance is super small, they go out of the window quickly and find it difficult to return to a state of regulation. DBT was super helpful to me, or for me. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, their window of tolerance does get super small. And that's when you're going to see the lashing out. How dare you compare these two things? You're really invalidating me. CPTSD is nothing like narcissism. How could you? It's like, I'm really only describing it so that I can help people see the difference. It's like, if you have CPTSD, do you want people to confuse what you have with narcissism in the future? Probably not. And so when I try to explain it, that's really all I'm trying to do. Because me personally, like, it doesn't bother me at all to hear a CPTSD versus narcissism comparison, or an ADHD versus narcissism comparison, or even an addict and narcissism comparison. Yeah, like, for that button in me, it's just not present.
Right.
So it's more difficult for me to understand it, why it bothers people, but it certainly does bother people. I know that.
Well, I think that, if you are looking to get better and you are looking to grow, you might want to ask yourself, if you're walking around looking for a reason to be offended all the time, that you're probably living in victimhood. If you're always looking for a reason to be offended, then you're playing the victim, because you'll be the victim of anybody who offends you, which could be so many people on so many different
I think
levels.
the motivations for it, recognizing what someone's motivations are for it. And so if someone's listening to this and they can recognize it in themselves, why am I doing this? Like, really? Like, what do I get when I prove my victim point? What does
Right.
that do for me? What's the survival mechanism there? What is this something that I learned in childhood? Is this an extension of some sort of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Is it pain avoidance? What is it? I think just recognizing that is key and being able to recognize it without judgment. Because then that's the other part. Like, I don't try to judge people for like when they have these jolts. Now it becomes the most difficult though when they're in that jolt and you try to get them to like
Yeah.
talk to them, like when
Yeah,
they're
because
just
they're
in that
emotionally flooded,
there's
they're
just no like
yeah,
maybe they can come back to it later, but when they're in it, that reactivity is going to get in the way. But
absolutely.
everyone's going to have something like that. And I think a good thing to frame it as would be is do you want to be right about how bad it is? Or do you really want to improve? Because there comes a point where those two choices, they're going to start looking different. Like if you're going to choose to try to really improve and get better, your choices are going to look different than the choices you would make if you just want to be right about how bad it was. And that was a big defining moment for me where it's like, okay, do I want to be right or do I really want to improve? Because they do look different. Like the action steps for thinking one way versus the other are going to look a little bit different. And that's why I like some of the capitalist porn people, like I was telling you about before we went live here. Like they help me because they're kind of brutal in some ways, but I like them for me. And I don't try to tell everyone else, oh, you should definitely be thinking this way too, because that can be pretty invalidating. But I would say, like, oh, if I don't like where I am, I'm responsible for that. Like, I'm responsible for where I am. And notice, even just saying that, I know there's people that would be like, but no, I'm not, but this, but that, but blame, but anyone but blame themselves. And it's like,
Right.
but okay, you might be right to a point with you're not completely responsible for where you are, but is that serving you to be able to admit to say that? Is it serving you to blame your parents or to blame society or to blame someone or something? Or would it serve you better to focus on what you can change? And I think some people just really get caught up on, nope, I'm going to be right that it's not just my fault. It's also other people's fault, which is true. It is, people do influence us. Like no one chooses their parents. No one chooses their face. No one chooses their genes. No one chooses how tall they are, how good looking they will be. All of these things are out of our control. We don't choose our environment. You didn't choose your stepfather. There are certainly things that we did not choose. But
Right.
at the same point, also, I say, yes, that's all true. But I'm going to try to work with what I can work with.
But here's
That's where my power is.
the other thing though, and I think this is a really important point that I want to make is if at anywhere along the way I had been engaged in a therapeutic process or had a support system that allowed me to tell my victim story and to feel like a victim because I was a victim and express how I felt being victimized, I don't think I would have had to spend so many years in victimhood. Like I feel like
Mm.
a lot of it was just trying to get somebody to hear me and acknowledge and validate what I had gone through was fucking horrible. And I never got that. I didn't get it till the pandemic actually. I was in therapy during the pandemic and my therapist said something about me being wounded as a child. I'm like, I wasn't wounded. And she's like, yeah, all these childhood wounds you have. And I'm like, wounded?
You didn't even know.
Had no clue. No, these are just my defects of characters. I'm not wounded, you know. Um, but for the first time, somebody acknowledged like that I had been wounded as a child, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks because I think that had been so much of what built that like chip on my shoulder and the victimhood and the need to be what it was just a need to be heard and like for someone to hear and validate and understand how much that sucked to go through.
And
you
that's
know?
also part of it too, right? The people that get really reactive about it, you don't know where they are in particular. Like for all we know, they might have had something terrible happen just like last week. We don't know. We don't
Right.
know where they are. And I think, and for you, like you didn't even think you were wounded and you had been through SA, like severe SA really, and you didn't think you were wounded.
No. Yeah. It's our self-image can be very distorted,
Sure.
you know? And I
Well,
spent my whole life playing the victim while trying to be the hero at the same time. Like trying to top every accomplishment and, you know, climb every mountain and accomplish every challenge and build every, you know, rocket to the moon just to prove my worth over and over, and at the same time balancing that out with that. So it's like that hero's journey story, like everybody loves that hero's journey story where you're the underdog and then you like, you're like Rocky and then you win the championship and then you're the hero, but then what?
right.
You know what I mean? Like some point you got to step out of that story, um and live a new story, man.
Sure. But that's the other thing too. I think that's the actually like the benefit for those of us who struggled with addiction stuff. It's one of those things where it forces you, if you're going to do it to try to get better, to take a look at it because you are doing something that's hurting you. Like when you're drinking to excess or using drugs to excess, it's pretty clear there's something you're also doing that's not serving you. So it forces you to say, okay, what am I doing here? And they'll say there, right, a disease of total self-centeredness. And we all have shortcomings and defects. And how are we presenting ourselves? And most people who are in that, they're not like beacons of hope in society when they're in active addiction. Like they're not like, oh, we're just. And I was thinking about this today before we went live. I was like, just to even say addiction is a disease of total self-centeredness, I was imagining the pushback I would get for saying that. And that's where, because I know what the haters will say. I know what the naysayers say. They'll say, that's a survival mechanism. That's not just being totally self-centered. That was a survival mechanism. It's like more than one thing can be true at the same time. Like
That's right.
most addicts, it is self-centered. And but the fact that they would probably struggle to see it that way. This goes to show you like how far, like I don't even know how the rooms do in this day and age with all of this thinking out there now. It's probably a struggle because back in our day, we would come in there and they'd be like, "Shut up, like do
Shut up,
this
sit
and
down.
shut up,"
Yeah.
and that people today would be like, "Oh no, we can't be. You're so invalidating." But it's like there comes a point where there was wisdom in some of the things they were saying, for sure.
Yeah, and there still is, and the thing is, like when I first went into the program, and they talk about being self-centered, I'm like, that's not true. If there's 4 pork chops and 5 of us at the table, I'll say you have the pork chops. I'm not self-centered. That's selfish. There's a difference between selfish and self-centered. Self-centered is all of your thoughts being centered around finding ways and means of getting more and getting yourself out of this and just trying to cover your ass with that and like
But you know
what
what
do
they'd
people
say,
think of
Lisa?
me? What's that?
They would say, even the person, there's 4 pork chops and 5 people, and you give it up. It's a way of getting your own needs met too, to say, oh, see, I'm so helpful. I'm so generous that I'm giving up that pork chop to someone else. So even people pleasing to an extent can also be like a selfish behavior. It's like it's a sneaky way to get your own needs met.
People
But
pleasing is a self-serving behavior. There's
yeah,
a difference between people pleasing, like it's a difference between niceness and kindness. Like being nice is like doing it for you to like me. Being kind is something that comes internally from
yes.
my spirit. And being nice comes from me wanting to manipulate you somehow by making you think that I'll give you what you want or whatever. So I don't want to ever be nice, but I'm always kind.
Yeah, kind is the way to go. Do you
What
know who
comes
Teal
to your
Swan
spirit?
is?
Yeah.
She was making that distinction before, the big difference between nice and kind behavior. And I think she was even talking about it in terms of dating and guys that would say they're the nice guy or the good guy. And they're like, are you really so nice or good? Or are you
That
really
creeps
being
me
more of
out.
a people pleaser? Are you really just being a people pleaser? Are you really giving to get? Are you
Yeah,
really just trying to get this girl to like you so she'll sleep with you? Like all of those kinds of things that a quote unquote nice guy would do.
right.
It's
But
like, is that
nobody, if you got to tell somebody that you're nice, that's like saying, I'm not a serial killer. Like, you, if you have to say that you're nice, or you have to say that you're humble, or you know what I mean? It's like, then are you? Let's like, no adult says, I'm a grown ass man. No, because they're adults. So,
it's
you
for
know
the
what I mean? Only kids say that, right?
the guys who say they're alpha too. I can't stand that either. It
So if
always it reminds me of Game of Thrones, where Tywin Lannister says, "Any man who has to say they're the king is no true king." I
right,
think that about the guys who say they're alpha, or the guys who say they're a nice guy, or many of the women who say I'm just such an empath. It's like my friend P Dubs here had said, it's like someone who has blonde hair. They want to say, "See, I got blonde hair. I got blonde hair."
right.
It's like, no, you don't need to say that.
You don't
Like,
need
you
to.
know, like people can see. Just let your actions do the talking. But I think it's another way. It's like a similar tactic to playing the victim. It's a similar tactic to people pleasing. Now you could also call it a survival mechanism too, sure.
But it
But
doesn't
it's getting
matter.
people to see you a certain way.
But it doesn't matter whether you, whatever you label it, doesn't really matter. The point is, we all do this shit. We all have our ways of trying to get our needs met in ways that are healthy and not healthy, functional and dysfunctional, and to just acknowledge and have some compassion for each other and ourselves in seeing that we're all human and we're all just trying to do the same thing, which is get our needs met, right? Um, that's the self-centered part of everyone, is we want to get our needs met, right? We want to be loved and seen and understood,
Right.
or whatever it is.
I think
um,
that's a good distinction. That even a survival mechanism, even a pain avoidance technique, that is selfish. It's about you. Now, granted, there's a there's healthy selfishness in a way, even though the word selfish has a negative context. There's good ways, like healthy ways to get your own needs met. And then there's more toxic type ways to get your needs met, right? So just recognizing getting your needs met can be a form of selfishness, but there's healthy versions of like self-care and self-love too. So maybe that's what I should call it. I should call it self-love and self-care and self-respect as opposed to selfishness. Because selfishness always seems to have a negative connotation.
well, I think that's the problem with labels of all kinds, is that once you slap a label on it, then you've got to judge it,
Right.
and or other people judge it. But if you want to get better for yourself, just don't worry about what the label is. Don't worry about whether it's this or that. But if it's something inside you that you don't feel good about when you engage in it, if it's a behavior, a pattern that you don't feel comfortable with or isn't serving you anymore, change it. Don't worry about what the label is. Just work, focus on your side of the street and change it. It doesn't matter. I think when once we put stuff in a box, man, we're like really selling ourselves short.
Right. I want to say this here too. So P Dub says, see, and I think a narcissist would walk into a room and think everyone admired them, where he has CPTSD. It's paranoia, internalized worries that people don't like me. I mean, yeah, that's like the neurotic part of a CPTSD.
Yeah, I would fall into that category for sure. I walk into the room and think everybody doesn't like me. Yeah.
Right. And the narcissist could, and this is where it all would depend though, too, all right? Because there's two different schools of thought on the narcissist. Some people will say, oh, the narcissists are so insecure and they do everything they do to cover up that insecurity. And then the other side would be, actually, no. And others would say, well, they have feelings of superiority and grandiosity, or they wouldn't be considered a narcissist. So, and how that presents itself, no, it really depends. But the bottom line would also be, does it matter? Like if the narcissist is really insecure, or do they really have just grandiose sense of self, feelings of superiority, and they believe it? What does it mean for the rest of us?
Well, that's it. It doesn't matter what it doesn't matter what's driving them. It matters what's driving you. It matters how you set boundaries for yourself. And if you find you're constantly having to set boundaries on both sides of the relationship, chances are, you're not in a healthy relationship. So it
Right.
doesn't matter what the other person's motivation is. It just matters how you handle it, and creating and setting and teaching people how to treat you by setting good boundaries.
Right. I was going to say something that you were saying before, but I can't remember what it was now.
Mm.
but it was I said that text instead. But I think it was just about overall learning. Oh, that's what it was going to be. So I think it's so important in any group dynamic to have people that are doing well with something that you can be looking up to. But when there's people that like they're just getting support and validation, but they're not necessarily doing very good, like the people that they're getting support and validation from are also like in a not so good place. That doesn't go too well sometimes. Like, yeah, you can validate yourself into nowhere. Like there has to be people, and that's why things like AA and NA work because, well, there's still people there that do have clean time. There's people there that have 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So they might be messing up in other ways. Absolutely.
Because we
But
all do.
right, but they're still able to at least have that going for them where, okay, you want to stay clean. That's the one promise of those rooms that you'll stay clean. Well, they're doing that. So it doesn't mean you're not going to need help from outside areas, but in terms of that one thing, that's something that they have going for them. And I think this would be true for like borderlines. It'd be true for CPTSD, true for ADHD. It's like you want to follow the people that seem to be doing well. You want to like they're in a good place with it, not the people who are still at ground zero, not the people that are like just like conveying the war stories. And that's what we mentioned before too. It's like there's BPD war stories, there's self-aware narcissist war stories, there's probably ADHD war stories, CPTSD war, like the equivalent of what would be considered
Right.
war stories. And for those who don't know, a war story in AA and NA would be just talking about the good old days of
Good
drinking
old
and
bad
drug
days.
use.
Yeah.
Right. And people get caught in that stinking thinking, I guess is what they would call it too. But it's thinking that makes you temporarily feel good, I guess. Like when you're in that place, you can feel good to do it. But notice also when you're doing better, you no longer get that enjoyment from the war stories though either. Like it's not going to sit the same way with your spirit anymore. To be like, "Oh yeah, that was so cool to do that." Like no, if you're in a not so good spot, you might think that. But
Right. The
when
person with the worst story, the person who's eating out of the garbage can is the winner of the worst story, which
yeah,
is so ridiculous. But here's the thing, right? Like if you focus on the problem, whatever the problem is, right? If you're just focusing on the problem, you're not going to get better. You have to be solutions focused. That's what the basis of the 12-step programs are. That's the basis of, most therapeutic processes. It's focusing on solutions instead of problems. If you're
right.
problems focused, then you're living in victimhood, right? If you're solutions focused, you're empowering yourself to make change.
And I guess the big thing would be what are the solutions, right? And I guess what the solutions are, it really just depends on what the issue is. Like someone who has CPTSD, solutions would be, well, are you going to go to EMDR? Are you going to go to someone like yourself and do EFT, tapping? Are you going to do DBT? Are you going to do CBT? Are you going to go to a support group? Are you going to go to AA or NA? And what are the solutions? And even just going isn't enough either. Like you got to go and then do footwork
Right.
and then try to actively change. And that's what's cool about the steps too, I think, is it like that's the footwork. Like the footwork is you're learning about yourself, you're getting some self-awareness, and they have accountability for you in place in
Right.
places like that. You have a sponsor, you have your group, your home group, etc., that you go to. And those are the people that would also hold you accountable a little bit. And
Right.
but they got that structure. I
Right.
think what happens a lot of times is with these other things, there's not nearly as much of a structure. It's like the community aspect is maybe there, like online, I guess, in some cases, but it could just be like client and therapist. Is there a community there? Not really, I guess, but it really just depends, right? Because that's still a business. A therapist and a client is still a business, so that you're kind of constrained to the limitations of a business relationship. There's
But again,
something.
it doesn't have to be either or. We can avail ourselves of so many different resources. We don't just have to pick or choose one or another.
Of course, there's so many to choose from.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the other benefits of a free thing is like there is no constraints. of a business going on. It's like, no, this is like you go to AA or NA, that's all about like, oh, this is a life or death thing because it is, right? Especially right now for people. There's so many people that I've seen die in the last just year or two that there's tons of people that that's just how important it is. And I think, and I'm not saying any of this to downplay the importance of paid help as well. Paid help can be very useful. I think it's just one element, though. It's one element, and there's other elements that could come into play. And I think it'd be pretty cool if there was more CPTSD groups, more productive borderline groups, etc. And you could make an argument that's what AA and NA is too, because how many people that are going there don't have CPTSD? How many people are going there? I mean, it's probably a mishmash. It's a mishmash of BPD, narcissism, CPTSD, PTSD, ADHD, bipolar, anxiety, depression. It's everything. It's everything all mixed into one. And yet somehow it still works. Like somehow it does still help people.
I think because there's the understanding is that everyone's welcome, no matter where they came from, what their deal is, what they're going through, how they're living. Like there's, like they accept everyone right where they're at. They don't expect them to be at a certain level before they walk in the door or anything else. There's, like they just take you as you are. And you don't find many places or people that will just accept you, flaws and all. And so my philosophy are two things: fail forward and do the footwork and let go of the outcome. But you got to do
the other thing that's helpful for people is like your triggers, like the things that you get an emotional jolt from. They're signposts. They're signposts pointing you in the direction of, okay, this is something that maybe I haven't processed fully. Maybe this is something that it's bothering me for a reason. Why is it bothering me? So the people that, if you ever say, oh, take a look at your side of the street, why is that bothering me when I hear that? Is it bothering me because I was in a relationship with a narcissist that blamed me for everything? Is that why? Yeah, and that's an understandable reason to why it could be. But also, no, yes, that could be why. And it is still a problem, though, too. It's like, yes, that's why. But then more than one thing's true at the same time. It still means you got work to do. It means that when you're in a good place with it, you are way less likely to get that jolt. Because that's how you know you're in a good place with it. You can see it and not be like, and like get skewered. Like, no, that's not going to happen. But if you get that jolt every time you see it, and know where I see it the most, if I ever gender a post, if I ever say, it hasn't happened recently actually, but when I would say male narcissist, all the men that would be not in a good place, I'm like, no, but what about the female narcissist? Or if I ever say a female narcissist, but what about the male narcissist? As
right.
like,
Everybody's
just the fact that they get that jolt means
if you spot it, you got it.
There's something not quite processed there. And it's not a bad thing though either. It's part of the process. I think that's another thing too. Like, yeah, you can get a jolt and there'll be people that'll be there for you that are not going to judge you and be like, oh, see, that just means you're a terrible person. It means you're wrong or fill in the blank with some negative thing. It's like, no, it's just part of the process. The process is it's totally understandable to get that jolt. Now, where it would become a problem is you're still getting that very same jolt like 2-3 years later and you haven't moved through it and you're still in that jolt. What has happened then? That means to me you've been stuck in victim mode more than likely. And that's the danger of it. The danger of victim mode is it's safe. It feels safe, even though it's probably not safe, but it feels safe and secure, like a nice security blanket, but it keeps you stuck. And there's that growth very rarely is the growth going to be comfortable.
No, it's not.
It's going to be uncomfortable. And
very
so
uncomfortable.
It just is.
We got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I mean, that's all there is to it. You just got to lean into the awkward and lean into the ick. And
yeah,
like if we looked at each other and ourselves as instead of like bad people trying to get good, but rather the sick people trying to get better, like then we have some compassion for ourselves and other people. We have compassion for ourselves. We have more compassion for other people and vice versa. So,
I mean, the sick people getting better in particular for like alcoholism or addiction, like the CPTSD stuff. I guess I guess there's more just like trauma with that, but the principle is still the same. It's like everyone should be trying to improve, and it's not like a condemnation to being a to getting these negative jolts. It's just part of the process, and to understand that. And I think just even being aware of that and people having the acceptance of others to say, yeah, we understand. We're not here to jump down your throat. It's okay. But that's what people think, though. People think, uh-oh, he compared CPTSD and narcissism. He must not be on my team. He must be trying to say I'm like that evil narcissist person. So he can't be good. And that's like really where their thinking goes. But it's not a productive way. And that's where those mindset tricks, they do well for me. It's like, who would I want to be like? Like, how do they think? What are they doing? It's like what they so much of what I do, a lot of it, and I keep on saying this with you in particular, because a lot of what I talk about is like kind of centered in what I learned in NA and AA. So many of those things, they have a saying for everything. It's like, oh, you want what we have, you got to do what we do. Things like that. And that's true for so many things. It's not just that. That's why it's wisdom. Like the wisdom is, yeah, that saying that applies to so many things. And I would be really careful mimicking the behaviors of people that and the actions of people that you don't want to trade places with them. It's like, I'd be careful with that if I were you. Like, unless you want to trade places with them, unless you're very happy where that person is, I'd be very careful. It's like doing what they do, because you're probably going to wind up just like how they are, for better or for worse.
yeah. Yep.
Well, I guess that could be a good place to wrap it up here for today, unless you wanted to mention anything else here before we close.
No, I don't think so. The only other thing I can think of is just imagine like if everyone approached each other the way that the 12-step fellowships approach each other, with just that welcoming acceptance of wherever people are at, and that they know that they're there for help, and knowing that they're sick, and accepting that, yes, of course you're sick. That's why you're here, because you want to get better. You know what I mean? And I just think that if we were able to take such an enlightened approach for other mental illnesses, that things would be different.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I guess it depends on what gets in the way. I think it depends on each individual situation what gets in the way, right? So for the borderlines, something gets in the way. For CPTSD, something gets in the way. And a lot of it just might be social media. Like social media is not really the best place to be always learning about some of this stuff and improving. Like, it's better than nothing and gets people started in a process, but it's not the end all be all a lot of times. Like, the work needs to be continued outside of social media. And I think maybe that's the part that's missing for some people. But I think that would be a great foundation. The people, if they have that non-judgmental attitude like they do in the rooms, and they had that towards all these other issues, and then more importantly, even having the people who have those issues be understanding of it in regards to others as well. Because even the people in the room struggle with that. Like, they struggle with the people that aren't in their group. All these things we're talking about, they can do those very same things, just in a different setting.
Right. We're all human.
But within that setting, they're good. Within that setting, they're on the same page and they can be good. But you put someone in there that has a little bit of a belief system that's not in perfect alignment with theirs. Ooh, boy. Like some MAT, some medically assisted treatment, or some other kind of psych med thing. Oh boy, that's a whole different story, right? Or what's considered clean and what's not.
Right.
Oh, that's a whole nother story.
Then the unconditional love isn't quite so unconditional, but
no, then it's in question then. But the same thing applies to those people in the rooms. I would say to them, if that really bothers you, you got to ask yourself why. Why does that bother you? Why does it bother you if this other person's doing this And like, how does that impact you? Does it? Is it disrupts your thinking, I guess? But for what it is with each individual person is going to be different. But it's just something to pay attention to. It's something to notice. But where can people find you though, if they want to work with you? Because you didn't talk about this, but maybe you could do a little quick pitch about what you do to help people.
Well, I'm an EFT practitioner. That's the tapping. And I've been working as an EFT practitioner for over 20 years. And you can find me at centerforoemotionalfreedom.com.
Right on. And you take clients remotely, right?
I take clients remotely. I work over Zoom or phone, and I specialize in trauma, PTSD, veterans, and adults, survivors of child abuse.
Yeah. So I would say, in particular, for people that have experience with SA, and especially as a child, and you want to talk to someone who truly gets it because they've been through it themselves, Lisa's the person to talk to for that. Because I totally get that too, right? It's just like with narcissism. A lot of people don't want to talk to someone about that unless the person they're talking to understands it. And I could see the same thing for an SA kind of thing, right? It's like, well, you want someone to understand it that's been through it and has come out the other side.
Right. So that's not going to be like flinch or be uncomfortable listening. That's what I always hated about therapists when I was a kid was this. I would talk about what happened and they would get all squirmy.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Before, I'm like, if you can't comfortably hear what I'm saying, I'm not going to talk to you, right? So
because it makes you think, how can they help you? How can they help you if they're getting so uncomfortable just hearing it?
Right. And there's nothing I haven't heard. So nothing makes me uncomfortable. But I do think it's helpful to have somebody who's, not walked in the same shoes maybe, but just has had similar experiences and can, again, like I have come a long way from where I was, and EFT has been my primary source of healing. So, along with many other things.
Sure. All right, Lisa. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show here and sharing your experience with us.
Thanks, Jared.
You have a good one. Have a good one, everyone. Thank